Welcome to the Art of Engineering, discovering the overlap of engineering and art.
Hello and welcome to the Art of Engineering podcast. I'm your host, Chad Harden, chair of the ASC Orange County Branch Structural Engineering Institute, and I'm really excited because we have David Malki today here with us. Thank you, David.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Chad.
And David is the author of the comic strip Wondermark. You can find it online at wondermark.com. And it's a comic strip constructed of 19th century book and magazine illustrations. David also publishes articles, books, creates t-shirts, wondermark-related art and products, and is the genius or co-genius behind other fun projects, like the Machine of Death anthology and game. There's a number of other sites which I'll list on the website that you can find from Wondermark, but there's Topatoco, where you can buy some great shirts and other products related to Wondermark, a podcast that David was involved with, tweetmeharder.com. And with that, thanks, David.
I'm excited. Let's talk about engineering.
Well, first I have to say a couple of the really fun things I've got from your website over the years. Your hyperbolic upgrade stickers are these wonderful stickers where it's like you can put a sticker on something and it's a time machine. It's really
these are stickers that in case somebody hasn't seen them, they look like warning or advisory stickers that you would see on a piece of machinery,
right?
Except that the text of them says something like, "Warning: this device contains atoms."
Right.
And so it originally started with the idea that by just making something look really exciting and cool, like it was like nuclear powered or something, that you could turn anything, you could upgrade anything into like something like a better version of itself.
Right.
And that evolved slightly into just saying things that were very obvious but seemed unusual to people who didn't, know physics.
Right.
And so that's a joke.
Like a hazard sign,
Right.
You immediately know a nuclear hazard sign, the symbol, what it looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of people find those really cool, and I think I'm going to make some new ones soon as well.
Oh, cool.
That's a fun kind of experiment in infographic, I guess you could say, that, or just iconic graphic design, but put to purposes that are slightly unusual.
Right. Along those lines, a lot of what you do, there's an element of science or wonder to it, obviously. Like, for example, one of my favorites, I was just looking over some that I had posted like on Facebook for friends or whatever. And one of them was it was comic 795. It's a lost cat. And instead of posting a picture of the cat, the description is like a numeric algorithm of counting stripes. I mean, it's hilarious.
So that particular one, and I'll read it actually.
Oh yeah.
So
please do.
It's a 3-panel comic, and in the first panel, it's just a close-up of a lost cat sign, and the sign reads, "Lost cat, no pictures, but yellow eyes about 1.2 centimeters each, whiskers 10 right, 13 left, gray with faint stripes at approximately 3 centimeter intervals. If it is the correct cat, his total number of stripes, including tail, plus 4326011, is my phone number.
Right.
Reward." And then second panel, there's a fellow reading the sign, and then the third panel, he's taking a ruler to a cat who's just lying on the ground. And the cat's saying, "Now what?"
Right.
So this is, I think the most interesting thing about that particular strip is that that's based on a real sign that I saw.
Oh, are you serious?
I was on a walk, and it was a lost cat sign that was written clearly by a kid. It had like the sort of multicolored markers, and like there was not a photograph on the sign, which I felt like was a real omission on the part of the parents who probably helped this kid. But there were a lot of descriptions. It was gray. It had blue eyes.
Oh my gosh!
And then there was like a marker drawing of what the cat looked like in the kid.
So sweet.
And like it hurt my heart because it's like, how would I know if I saw this cat?
Right.
This is not the most efficient way to do this sign. And I saw multiples of them that were each handwritten slightly differently. Like this poor kid sat and wrote out 10 signs and put them all up over the neighborhood, and
that's heartbreaking.
It really is. And so anyway, I just mined that for comedy.
That's funny. Well, so that's part of your sounds like part of your process. You draw from your daily life.
Yeah, I mean the comic strip is in some ways observational, and it seems weird to say that when like there's so many like weird things in it, and it's a gag strip, which means there's not really a story or much continuity. And so that means it can kind of be about anything. And it, as you mentioned before, it's made from Victorian era illustrations, and so sometimes it feels like it's in that time, and other times there's references to things in the modern day, and so I kind of like to play around with never being clear exactly like what the world is that these characters occupy, and so that means the rules of that world can be very flexible.
Okay.
And but conceptually, it's usually very directly in the case of the cat thing, but other times it's just like something that happens in life, and then I'm been doing this long enough now that situations sort of spool themselves out into comics in my mind. Like if I'm at the grocery store and someone says something weird, it's like, okay, well that means that they just came from the bank, which meant that, but why are they wearing swim fins or something? And it's like it just kind of like writes itself in that cadence of like a setup punchline.
Right.
So a lot of things are inspired by either things that I see or things that I hear or things that I read and then have like a reaction to, which is I think where all creativity comes from. And the fact that the strip is very amorphous in terms of its content means that I can make up new characters, I can put it in a weird setting, I can invent props that you've never seen before, just depending on the needs of that particular concept. So that's really freeing. And
then because I guess as an engineer, I notice things in there like science related. Did you enjoy science in school or engineering or math? Or?
So it's funny. I mean, we were talking a moment ago before you recorded about your work in introducing kids to engineering and so on. And so my dad was a mechanic.
Okay.
And so I grew up in his garage. And so he was always, having me come out and help him turn a wrench or...
Right.
sit and pump the brakes while I, bleed the cylinders or whatever.
Okay.
And so I had a very hands-on experience with, just mechanical things growing up. And so I feel like my mind bends that way in terms of like putting things together and let's get your hands on something and see how it works. And I'm a big proponent of that.
Right.
But formal education, not really. And in fact, I did not quite understand what an engineer was, I would say, until I was a teenager.
Okay.
And I remember my dad telling one of his friends when I was a kid, like, David's going to be an engineer, and I didn't know what that meant. And I think I have a lot of affection for, the sciences, but I really don't have much formal education in it. So anything that I've sort of learned has been either hands-on or just, self-taught over the years.
Right. Some of my favorite things I see, you grab an illustration from, or maybe you draw these, I don't know. Like, this is one, it's number 1193. I mean, at the end of the scene, a locomotive is just piled itself out of the second story of a building.
So the illustrations are all found in old books in usually in pieces, and then I'll put them together.
Okay.
So it's almost like playing with Legos, where I'll find a person and a setting and a prop and this head on this body and sort of build the exact thing that I feel like is best for the strip.
Okay.
And it's funny that you mentioned that one in particular, because the locomotive crashing out of the building, that's a very famous train accident from like the late 1800s.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, there was an incident where I think it's in Paris, and the train went off the track and like barreled through the station and ended up coming out the second story window.
Holy cow.
And so that is like a contemporaneous like illustration of that scene,
right?
Which I had seen in the books before, and then I realized, I could use it in the strip,
right?
But there was another strip that I did years ago that also featured a train accident, and in that one I made it from a picture of a train and then a picture of a barn, and everything. Okay. So sometimes you find little gems like that, and that you can kind of repurpose, and other times you can kind of build it.
That's funny. It's one of the. It's like one of those things where you can't make this stuff up, right? And then that finds its way in.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of like straddling that line of like, you don't know if this was a thing that I just invented, or maybe it really was like that. And you know, if you know that I take these from old books, I get that question a lot, which is like, does that mean that you found a weird picture of blah blah blah? And it's like, well, no, I actually made it, in Photoshop, but I want to make it look like it came from another era,
right? And then just one more thing on this strip. I love the last line, and this is not unlike engineering, at least. It's funny, but it's, okay, listen, nobody do what I did. And I'll post this on there so people can get the context of the whole strip. But that's not unheard of even on a day-to-day basis. Like, you go through this, sometimes we have to design really weird things at work. and you have to just do something new, and you might start in the wrong way. And then I think I've almost said that maybe to somebody or a friend of mine said it to me while we're working. It's like, okay, we shouldn't do it that way again because it was really hard, or it didn't work and I had to do it all over again.
Well, one recurring theme that you'll find in the strip if you read more than a handful is the notion of like inventing something or coming up with an idea or trying to build something, or that kind of creative, constructive process is something that I just think a lot about, and it occupies my days. With I just make things for fun, and also I try and design products and design items that I can use in my daily life, or that maybe someone else would want to buy or whatever.
Right.
And so there's a lot of like tinkering, either physically or sort of conceptually. And so that process of I got a great idea, and then it either it had these like huge complications, and in whatever way, that basic premise is the core of about I don't know 20% of my of all my comics.
Okay. There's a quote I like from Mark Twain. I think it's attributed to other people too, but this I think applies to you. Is find a job you enjoy doing, and you will never have to work a day in your life. I think you're such a candidate for that because you do so many different projects, and it's obviously something that you love doing. I don't know if you can comment on your evolution of your career. I mean, did you ever see yourself like where you are now, or what bends in the road took you here?
Yeah. Well, I think I have always, liked to draw and liked to write. And any time that I have just sort of had time to myself, like as a kid or, even as a teenager, I was always trying to make something or write something or do a story or make a book or something like that. So I feel like that's a thread that's stayed consistent throughout my entire life. And, for good or ill, like if you told me I could never be a writer, anything in the arts, I had to come up with another career, like I kind of don't know what I would do.
Right.
And I think I have other interests, but it has always been kind of a foregone conclusion that I would try and do something creative. So as far as that goes, like this particular expression of that, I don't think I could have predicted, but I feel like I always had that kind of North Star to kind of direct myself toward. So my degree is in film production. Okay. And I worked in the kind of film / advertising industry for a while. I used to make movie trailers. And the interesting thing about that is that it's also a process of taking things and putting them together in a new way to make a new thing. And so I felt like whatever, like inclinations I had toward that kind of work, I think were well served by that particular occupation. But there's only so long that I felt that I could do that while like trying to muster the level of creativity necessary in the service of something that was not my own and that I didn't care about and that somebody else would profit from and that I would, have to work long, hard hours for. I didn't find it to be sustainable for my own temperament. And there's many other people that are very, very skilled at that work, and maybe I was a little bit young and naive or whatever, but I just didn't feel like it was the thing I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I was always doing my own stuff on the side, just for fun, writing stories or making comics. And with Wondermark, I had just been posting comics online for no real reason, just kind of for fun to show friends. And I also had I'd seen other people make comics and post them online, so I figured if you make a comic, like that's the thing that you do with it. And over time, people started to pay attention, and it kind of got to spread around for a little bit. I started going to conventions just to see friends mainly, and then while I was there, see people respond to the work. And so over time, it kind of became this thing that took up more and more of my time as I found that there was a little flame there that I could stoke. And I was very lucky to be at a point in my career where I worked for an advertising agency full-time as staff, but then there was a point at which I went freelance and started working around town a little bit more, which meant I could kind of turn down jobs occasionally. And so I would work for a month, and then I would have a trip to a convention, and then I would come back and I would work for 2 months, and then I would go, head down and work on a project at home or something like that. And so over the course of about 3 years, I went from fully working on this one career to kind of, 75-25, 50-50, 25-75. And by the end of a few years, it was like, oh, I guess I don't really have the time to do the other thing anymore because I've just been doing this comic stuff.
Oh, that's fun.
So I never made this huge, I hope this works out. It was more like, okay, if this is working, I'm going to give it a little bit more time and a little bit more gas and sort of ease it into that gear.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it worked out at that time, certainly. And then I kind of established myself as well, I guess I'm doing this now for good.
Right.
And so I've had the challenge since then, and that was 2009, I think, was when I really kind of made that transition.
Okay.
And since then, it's just been all right, well, got to come up with something new, got to make another thing, got to do the next phase of this. Right. And that's, it is fun because it's I don't really have a job description, and so what that means is that I can kind of do anything I think is interesting, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. It also means that I got to come up with things to do.
Right.
There's no one telling me what my job is. Right. So it's on balance. I definitely enjoy it, but there are elements of it that are work, because it's running a business.
Right.
And I have to do tax paperwork like everybody else, and, whatever. So, and there are times when that can become very overwhelming, and you never get to be creative because you're just buried in logistical stuff that you wish you had an HR department to, do the workers' comp filings or whatever. Okay. So that's, the slight downside of it, but, on balance, I'll take it. It's something that I feel like if you have a sort of a entrepreneurial mindset, you can solve those challenges and sort of reap the benefits of being able to determine your own path. Right.
Oh, it's really unique. I think it's a unique position to be in.
Well, I think it's becoming more common, for sure. There's definitely, I think, less faith institutionally in this idea of I'm going to work for a company that will provide for me unquestionably, and so I think people are, at least among people that I know, there's more of an inclination to take one's fate in one's own hands, but I also, as someone who works in comics, I mean, that is an industry that has historically been populated with artists that were able to work with publishers and syndicates who were able to take care of all that kind of administrative stuff. And there are a lot of an older generation of cartoonists who don't have a smooth time making a transition into being more of an entrepreneur.
Oh, okay.
They just want to write a comic or draw a picture and send it in, and someone sends them a check. And that's a great way to live if you can get that gig. But those gigs are vanishing, Right. And so some people have a harder time making that transition. And I'm sure, let me be clear, 25 years, I'm going to be that old person being my business model, it evaporated. What do? I don't understand. And the kids are going to be we're all making holograms now, Grandpa, And I'll just be I don't understand how to save a hologram file. I don't, someone please do it for me. So that's coming. Don't get me wrong. I'm already 25% of the way there with Snapchat. Oh, right. Because this is a thing that I'm now slightly too old for. But, at least for the moment, I'm doing okay.
Right. No, I know what you mean. Back to, where you started before you went to film school. What led you to film school? What kind of things were you working on?
Yeah, so I actually started college as an illustration major. I wanted to do drawings, and I had two and it's very petty, but I had two moments that kind of changed my mind and put me on a different path. And one was that as an illustrator, specifically, you usually have to work for people, right? People will say, I need an illustration of X. Okay. And then you do that. That's how an illustrator works. And so I started to get those jobs because that's what you would do to make a career as an illustrator. And I would be hi, I'm here to, do the thing that you need me to do. And then they would be all right, here's what I need. And I'd be oh, this sucks, dude. I hate this. I want to do your thing. Your thing is dumb. Right. It's not fun. It takes up all this time. It's all hard. And I realized, it's it was a little bit of that inkling of what I mentioned a minute ago, which is like it's hard to muster creativity in the service of something you don't care about.
Right.
And especially at like 19, that's like screw you, old man. Like, I want to do my own thing.
Right.
So that was part of it, was like, maybe I don't actually want to make this a career because it wouldn't be fun.
Mm-hmm.
I would sort of lose the joy of it because I'd turn it into work.
Right.
And then also, I wanted to make comics and I wanted to tell stories. And I literally had this thought. If you draw someone, it's really hard. But if you take a video of someone, then it's like the drawing is made for you.
Oh.
And so it's like, what if I just made movies instead?
Right.
And of course, like, it's way more complicated than that. Like, you can easily make a really crappy video. But at the time, it was like digital video was just coming in, and like, it was like, yeah, man, absolutely. Like, the sky's the limit. So me and my buddy, we were roommates at the time, and we both kind of had come up together in high school and like making comics and designing, cool things we wanted to do. And so we both looked at each other and we said, let's go to film school. And so we went arm in arm off to film school. And, it's way more complicated than that, as it turns out. But but it was a good education in like the mechanics of storytelling and like telling, using visual information to convey information, or to convey narrative. And so I use a lot of what I learned in film school, even in comics or in storytelling in general. But I decided that I didn't want to be a filmmaker professionally, because it's a business that I feel like it's a very competitive business, and there are other people who care more about it than I do.
Right.
And I happen to find this a little bit of luck, in this other way.
Well, it's interesting the path, because it sounds like you wanted to do illustrating, and then you went to the film route, which told you how to tell a story.
Yeah. And
you like the idea of pulling from sources and combining that, and then it comes full circle back to Wondermark.
Yeah, no,
it's really interesting.
It is interesting, and I think that I can look back and find little tiny seeds of things I'm doing now, as a kid or as a child or as a young person or as a teenager, and so it's like I guess I was building toward this. I didn't realize it at the time. But like one of my key creative philosophies, if I have such a thing, is that every person has a unique set of skills, because everyone kind of takes a different path, and everyone is interested in different sorts of things, and everyone develops either like actual skills or just has experiences that kind of make them a slightly different person than the person next to you, and that combination of things is unique to each person, and so it's through the intersections of those things that we can have a perspective that is unique to us.
Right.
And so this particular job is something that I am uniquely qualified for.
Right.
In a way that maybe someone else would not be. But there are other jobs that I am less qualified for because I don't have the same experiences as someone who even is doing mostly the same thing.
Right.
So I think in those ways I've like carved a river in the canyon gradually, and now this is the only direction it flows.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit, maybe what your next project
you're
thinking about? Or?
Yeah. Well, so the thing with the comic strip, which I have been doing now for almost 14 years, is that there are only a few ways to make money from doing comics, and one of them is by making merchandise. And like Jim Davis of Garfield, will tell you this, right?
Right.
Because there's, he's a billionaire because he sells Garfield plushes and stuff.
Right.
And so, not that I'm not doing that obviously, but I would much rather try and use the comic to kind of say things I think are interesting and sort of get people who agree with me or think it's also interesting to pay attention, and then while I'm there be like, hey, you know what else I think is interesting and you might like as well, is this Christmas card. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I like that too. But that's the thing that now I can have a commercial interaction with them,
right?
And so it kind of takes on two sides, where it's like, well, we want to have this this conversation about ideas and humor and telling jokes, and then if you want to, if the 1% of you that feel like you can use this other thing in your life, that's a set of stickers or whatever, right, I'm going to offer that to you as well.
Right.
And it doesn't take very many people to actually like percentage-wise, if you have a big enough audience that you gain by giving things away for free and just, putting content out there, only a small percentage of them need to actually buy something for it to become sustainable. And I like making things. Like, I like designing things. I like coming up with ideas. I like, solving problems in life. And maybe the thing I came up with is something that someone else can use. Like, I make greeting cards, for example. I call them multi-purpose greeting cards, and you can tick the boxes to indicate what the occasion is and what the sentiment you're trying to convey. Right. So you just keep a box of those, and it's good for anything. Birthdays, anniversaries.
Yeah, they're hilarious. I love them. Actually, we got the holiday ones too.
Okay, yeah,
I sent them out to family and coworkers.
So that's the thing. It's
much to my enjoyment.
So that's the thing. Like, I like making it, and then you like using it, and hopefully the people who received it maybe got a laugh out of it.
Right.
Because it's also there's jokes.
Yeah.
And so that thing where it's like, it's a win-win,
right?
Because you found this thing that you really enjoyed, and I was able to kind of, make a business out of making that thing,
right?
And so we both are like helping each other.
You know what I love most about those cards is not the boxes that I check, but the boxes that I would never check because it would be so inappropriate. Like it's like you get a chuckle out of like, I couldn't check that one. Because,
right. Yeah, and that's kind of the joke of it. Is like, why would anyone need a card to talk about like this super weird thing at the bottom of the list? And so the absurdity of it is very appealing to me.
Right. So what do you do? I mean, you have such a creative job. What do you do on your free time to like relieve stress, or is there an art form that you enjoy besides all this?
So it's funny because I mentioned before the idea of turning it into work. I did the opposite now, where instead of turning my hobby into work, my work is my hobby.
Right.
So all the things that I like doing, I just do them all the time and make them my job.
Right.
So, this is a weird example, but because it's October, I had this thought. There's people that like get really into Halloween, and they get like costumes and they decorate and everything. And my wife is into this too. So like, I don't mean this. I have no negative, statement here, but what I'm about to say sounds kind of like that, which is to say, I see these people like do all this very creative stuff, and I made this really cool mask, and whatever, and I see that, and I'm like, yeah, why would you do that for free? Because my mentality is like, I have to muster my creativity in directions that, at least theoretically, can be realized commercially. Because otherwise, how do I eat?
Right.
And so, really, all my ideas that I end up having get pushed through that sieve of like, cool, could this be a project? Could this be a product, or could it be a thing on the website, or could this be a comic? And so I think any artist who's self-employed will tell you that like there's not a lot of free time because you have a lot of creativity invested into your work.
Right.
But there's one thing that has no relation to the rest of my work, and that is I have a pilot's license.
Oh.
And so I like to fly, and my dad was a pilot as well, and so I kind of, that was my real exciting thing as a kid, was to go flying with my dad. Cool. So like it's meaningful to me, and I don't do it often because it's like it's so expensive.
Right.
But it is a thing that when I am able to, it occupies so much of your mind that you are unable to think about anything else.
Right.
And so it's like relaxing.
Oh, that's nice. That's very cool. Sometimes when I'm working, I like to listen to kind of the same feeling, like electronica music while I'm working, because there's no words, and it kind of pushes out all that extra stuff. Because your mind's kind of following the beat. So I can do my creative thing where I'm sketching, an idea for my calculations or redlining a plan, and that electronica music pushes out. I love that way you said that. Kind of pushes out everything else, so you can kind of just be in the moment and enjoy it more. Yeah,
I think we give too much credence to the idea of multitasking. Like, I think we need to occupy our attention.
Right.
Otherwise, it's hard to focus sometimes.
Right.
I mean, I do that with podcasts where you can never like write while you're listening to a podcast, but if there's something mindless like drawing, or it's something that occupies a different part of your brain, you can listen to something in the on the computer, and then that occupies enough of your mind that you don't get distracted from the other thing. Right. It's like you can do two things at once. So if it's drawing and nothing, you'll find the second thing. But if you do if it's listening and drawing, then there's nothing else. You can do both those things.
Okay. Do you have time for some kids questions?
Kids question, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so I have some questions here from...
Let me be clear. I don't know how they're made.
Okay.
So I ask people,
right.
Then no one will tell me. So
okay.
I cannot offer advice.
Okay. See, the first question here, what made you choose to use Victorian pictures for your illustration?
That's a great question. So the Victorian era of illustration, for people who don't know, is the period from roughly the middle of the 1800s to close to the end, maybe 1895. And nowadays, if you open a book or magazine, there's usually photographs. And photographs are, things that will illustrate whatever the article is talking about. But at that time, photography was still very new. And the technology of the printing press at the time did not allow you to make photographs in a way that could be reproduced in a magazine. So whenever you wanted an illustration in your magazine, you had to make someone had to draw it. They had to make what's called an engraving or an etching. And so there's this period from about the middle of the 1800s to close to the end where every magazine and every book was filled with just amazing illustrations. And it became this really refined art over the years. And at the early, end of that spectrum, the drawings are usually quite crude. But by the middle and end of that, it was this full-fledged art form. So, and then once photography came in as a technology, then that job became unnecessary. And so, so the things I like about those illustrations are, number one, they're amazing to look at. And so by using those illustrations in my work ends up looking cool. And I can kind of ride on their coattails a little bit. And number two, it's something that we don't see very often. And so it feels like it's kind of another world or of another time. And so it gives it a feeling of being different and very distinctive. And then thirdly, because it is of another time, when you do something that is out of sync with that time, like you have these characters and they're talking about cell phones or something, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, which is funny. And so I don't think that that's what the humor relies on, but I think it's a nice little lay on.
Okay.
And I guess the fourth thing is because that means I can make a comic that I don't have to draw.
Right.
So that's nice too.
Right. So your current strip has some birds on it. And so this question is, do all your comics have birds? And if they do, why?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And sometimes they're out of panel.
Right.
Sometimes they're in the back.
Okay.
Sometimes they're just watching. And why is because they're always watching.
Right.
Birds are always watching us.
I like this question a lot too. Why is digital art so important to you?
Digital art. Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can interpret that phrase, but what I'm taking it to mean is making art on the computer. And in particular, the sort of thing I do relies on, taking something that's on paper and scanning it and then manipulating it. And so that's really hard to do if you don't have it in the computer. And it also ends up, the artwork I use ends up being copied and pasted multiple times, and that's something, again, that the computers can do really well. But in general, there are a lot of people who still work with traditional media, which is, pen, paper, and paint. And there's people who try and replicate the look of traditional media in the computer. The drawing programs that are available now can mimic the cool look of traditional media very, very well, while also allowing you to do things like, copy, paste, resize, flip back and forth and make corrections in ways that doing things on paper doesn't. So both methods of making art are really great and have a lot of pluses and minuses because you can have a lot of control over your work when you work digitally, but when you work with pen and paper, some people say that it makes you have to put more thought into each line because you can't erase it. And so you have to be more deliberate.
Right.
And so it gives you a different kind of effect in your work. That being said, I just finished a series of commissions for somebody who wanted drawings on paper. And so I did them, and it was great. But over the course of the process, there were several times when I messed up, and I had to start over because you can't erase an ink line on paper.
Right.
Whereas in the computer, you could easily correct it. So, but at the end, the person got a piece of art that is it's a physical piece of paper with ink on it that I touched, and that's important to people too.
Right.
So for making the comic, I don't think I would be able to make it without computers. Although I did try once using a photocopier and an X-Acto knife and Scotch tape, and it was so hard, and the result was not better than I could have achieved with the computer.
Right.
So for me, it's important, but in terms of making art, I think both methods are valuable.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I think on engineering, I've said this before in the podcast. One thing I found so valuable was learning from hand drafters, and now we don't hardly do any hand drafting, except I do redline or prepare sketches for the CAD drafters that prepare plans. So having that ability to have learned from the hand drafters, I can take that and it makes the digital better, the digital version better. I wonder, I think you have to be, it sounds like you have to, I guess my question to you is, do you have to be good at the hand drafting first before you make it into the digital?
Well, people will say that you should for that reason, that you should start with the fundamentals. I don't know that it's necessary, and I think that there's a generation of people who are going to come up strictly digitally. I feel like people who are learning to draw now are usually drawing online or are drawing, with a tablet in Photoshop or something.
Right.
Not to say that they would start that way, from the very beginning, but people are learning to use these very sophisticated painting programs that give results that you can't really get easily without having a whole, stack of paints on your shelf and so on. And just the physical act of painting in particular is much more laborious.
Okay, right.
Because you got to have paints and you got to have brushes and all this stuff. So, so I think a lot of people are starting out digitally for just ease. The reason of ease. But that being said, I don't know. I think people will tell you that it's good to learn to be able to draw, without that crutch in a way, because it makes you have to be more deliberate. But I'm not going to be a snob. I think if you are interested in drawing, you will find yourself drawing in different ways whenever you want to, or whenever you can. And I think one of the things that's very important for people learning to draw is what we call life drawing, which is drawing somebody who's modeling, or even just drawing anything that you see, whether it's a landscape or a person across the the way at the bus station or whatever. And a lot of times that's done by hand in a sketchbook because you're just sitting there, And if you have a sketchbook with you, and you are drawing things all the time, you're just going to be drawing it by hand. And doing that practice of life drawing is really important because it helps you translate what you see into what you draw. And that's a discipline that has to be learned. That's a skill that it has to be developed. And it's easier to do more of that if you're doing that in a sketchbook because you don't have to have your laptop or whatever. So I think because you should be doing more of that type of drawing, you should carry a sketchbook. And because you're carrying a sketchbook, you should draw on paper.
Last question is, was there one inspiration for you, either from the comics or in general?
Well, everyone of my generation who got into comics did it at least in part because of Calvin and Hobbes. And that's a strip that I hope has the kind of longevity that kids these days also know about. And I don't know that they do or don't because it stopped running in 1995.
Right.
But it's one of those strips that I hope will live forever. And it's in books, and I know that people like us share those with our kids.
Right. Right.
So that was a really important strip. But another one that I feel like doesn't always get credit for its artistic achievement is Peanuts, the Charlie Brown strip. And that ran for 50 years, 1950 to 2000. And unlike something like Garfield, which is also very popular, Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, drew every single strip by hand himself. And Garfield, for all, I give credit to Jim Davis for building an industry around it, but he doesn't draw the strip. He has a staff of people who write and draw the strip. Because they're creating a brand, more than making like an artistic statement. Whereas Peanuts, even though it became this giant brand, really at its core, it was Charles Schulz trying to communicate with the world and express the things he was feeling. And so as a creative body of work, it's like unparalleled. So anyway, because it had been running for such a long time, it was around, before I came around, and I grew up with older siblings, so we had those books in my house. And just reading through those books over and over and over as a kid, I think instilled the vernacular of comic strips, like the cadences and the sorts of things that comics could talk about, on a pretty deep level. And so I give that credit for sort of helping me learn the style of writing comics.
Yeah, those are two of my favorites, especially Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
And they both give like the wildness of being a kid as well as the struggles.
Right, absolutely.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
And especially Peanuts. I mean, it's funny because Peanuts has become such a like merchandise brand in ways that are kind of like pleasant, but the strip itself is full of like heartbreak and sadness and and is not unfunny for that. It's like it kind of shines a light on the struggles, like you said, of childhood or of particular, personalities, in our complicated world.
Right.
So, yeah, I think as a statement of the sorts of things you could talk about in comic strips, it was a pioneer.
Right.
In the 50s.
Okay.
And so it kind of set the stage for things like Calvin and Hobbes to come after it.
Well, thank you for answering the kids' questions as well as my own. And really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. It's so nice to chat with you.
Thank you. And you've been listening to The Art of Engineering. Tune in next time. Thanks again.
Thank you. You've been listening to The Art of Engineering. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and at www.taepodcast.com.